We're learning more about suspicious, potentially dangerous packages mailed across the United States. Federal, state, and local authorities are trying to determine who mailed pipe bombs to prominent Democrats, including former President Barack Obama and presidential candidate Hillary Clinton. WFMY News 2's Tahisha Moyes has the latest.
Well, it's important to note that all 7 of the packages were intercepted, but it is still concerning nonetheless. Now, this is a photo of the bomb that was sent to former CIA Director John Brennan at CNN's New York studio. It contained what appeared to be a live explosive device and an envelope containing white powder. 6 others had similar packages addressed to them. Former President Obama, former Secretary of State and presidential candidate Hillary Clinton, former Attorney General Eric Holder, Democratic Representative Maxine Waters, and liberal philanthropist George Soros. Now, the White House is condemning the incident, saying whoever is responsible will be brought to justice.
I just want to tell you that in these times, we have to unify. We have to come together and send one very clear, strong, unmistakable message that acts or threats of political violence of any kind have no place in the United States of America.
The FBI is testing 6 of the devices at its lab in Virginia. They were mailed in manila envelopes with bubble wrap inside, with the return address of Florida lawmaker Debbie Wasserman Schultz. All agencies investigating say the packages were potentially dangerous, labeling them as crude pipe bombs. And the question on everyone's mind is who is behind these suspicious packages? Well, the FBI is hoping to have a clearer picture in the days to come.